In the first part of my interview with Israeli Ambassador to the United States, Michael Oren, we discussed the threat of a nuclear Iran and the impact of the Six-Day War. But now I ask, in the immortal words of Vladimir Lenin, what is to be done? We're looking at this horrible situation. In the words of Lenin, what is to be done?
What is done is, first of all, be aware of the danger, to work together with international security services and pool information. And the United States and Israel and other concerned countries do pool such information, and we have learned immensely from our cooperation to understand that the Iranian regime has no intention of backing down on its nuclear program, and that they have rejected successive offers of compromise, some very good compromises indeed. They have slapped the outstretched hand of President Obama, and that now the world has to bind together and impose crippling sanctions on Iran in a last-ditch effort to get the Iranian regime to desist from enriching uranium and striving to achieve a nuclear capability.
What form of crippling sanctions? Can you specify what you have in mind here? And the second thing is that a lot of us have tremendous emotional response, positive response to the democracy movement, the Green Revolution in Iran. Will those sanctions cripple those people as well? How do you deal with that?
Well, we're looking at a whole range of sanctions, right? The sanctions that will do everything from impair the ability of the Iranian regime to do business internationally, to even travel abroad. Members of the regime will not be able to travel abroad freely. One of the most painful sanctions that can be levied on Iran is denying Iran refined petroleum products. Iran's got a lot of oil, but not much of it is refined. They have to import it. And yes, this will impact the Iranian population, but, and this is a big but, Israeli and American security experts are agreed that in the period before June 2009, the period before the upheaval surrounding the Iranian elections, if the taxi driver in Tehran had run out of gasoline, he probably would have gotten out of his cab and cursed America and Israel and the West. Now, in the aftermath of June of the elections, now with the rise of the opposition in Iran, that same cab driver gets out of his cab after it runs out of gas, and he doesn't curse America and the Zionists and the West. He curses his own government. Our assumption is that sanctions now will not strengthen the ties between the people and the government, but on the contrary, it'll widen the schism between them as people blame their own government in Iran for their lack of basic fuel and other commodities.
Speaking of the freedom movement, of the democracy movement, conservatives and libertarians in the U.S. have criticized Obama for not being more outspoken in his support. At the same time, there have been reports that on the street, and in fact I've heard them myself on video, that the demonstrators are yelling, Obama, Obama, which side are you on? Are you with us or are you with them? Do you think that the support by the U.S. has been sufficient for the democracy movement? What's your attitude on that?
I'm not going to second guess the president's handling of the Iranian situation. We have been very, very supportive of the Obama administration's policy on Iran, toward Iran to date. The situation in Iran is extremely complicated, and there is no Iranian expert, either in Israel or in the United States, who can tell you definitively what's going to happen in Iran. For example, there are members of the opposition within the government, including Mousavi himself, who are what we would call to the right of Ahmadinejad on the nuclear program. There were indications that Ahmadinejad was willing to accept at least one of those compromise packages that were preferred him, but the Mousavi opposition vetoed it. So we can't assume that within the government itself, the opposition is more amenable to compromise than the West, than the reigning government. We have to distinguish, though, between divisions within the Iranian leadership and the divisions between the Iranian leadership itself and the people. And therein, I think that there's room for promoting and supporting those people in their legitimate demands for democracy and freedom in Iran.
It's interesting because in reading your book, one of the things that, I went, oh yeah, I'd forgotten that, was the relationship between Iran and Israel during the days of the Shah, and the fact that it was the oil from Iran coming around through the Straits of Tiran that was part of the whole linchpin of the event. Do you think there's any hope for a renewed relationship between Iran and Israel?
Well, we certainly have no animosity whatsoever for the Iranian people. On the contrary, we revere the Iranian people. We have great respect for their ancient civilization and for their dynamic culture. And we know that there are many Iranians who feel the same way about us. And the only thing that stands between us is this pernicious, vicious Islamic extremist regime. Should that regime disappear for the world, I think the Iranian people and the Israeli people will revert to their traditional, historical friendship.
I'd like to believe that. Now, let's talk about the unmentionable, which is military action. At what point do you feel that that would become necessary? Suppose the sanctions that you want are applied and nothing really happens. What then?
Well, we think we have to see that first. You're getting into the field of hypotheticals. We now have several months at least to examine the efficacy of these sanctions. They're not even in place yet. It'll be several months before we even get them up and running. So we're getting far, far, far ahead of ourselves by talking about any other options. We do, however, agree with the Obama administration in keeping all options on the table. Without going too far into that, what that means, all options are on the table, and we are looking at these sanctions as they come into play. We'll be following them very, very closely to gauge their efficacy.
And what about China and Russia, specifically China, which seems to be relatively intractable on the sanctions issue? Do you think there'll be some movement?
Well, we hope so. Right now, we haven't been overly sanguine about the possibility of bringing the Chinese along. The Russians have come a long way, though. Russians were initially very adverse to sanctions, but they were surprised. They were surprised by the revelation of the Iranian secret site at Qom. The Qom facility, which could not have had a civilian use. It was too small to have been a civilian reactor. It could only have had a military end use. The Russians didn't know about it. And then the Russians were very insulted by the Iranian rejection of the compromise package. Part of the Iranian low-enriched uranium was to have passed to Russia for enrichment via France, and the Russians took umbrage at the fact that the Iranians basically slapped them in the face by rejecting the package. So now the Russians are, we believe, better poised and better disposed toward sanctions. We still do not know about the Chinese. There's a working assumption that if the Russians come on board, the rest of the international community comes on board, the Chinese will not want to be left out.
Do you think there's any use in continuing the discussion of these compromise packages at this point, or have they just become a method for the Iranians to go on enriching uranium and in fact, as they announced yesterday, enriching to higher levels?
Well, the compromise packages were never ends in themselves. They were a confidence-building measure where the international community could effectively set the breakaway clock back. Let's say Iran had 5,000 kilograms, 10,000 pounds of low-enriched uranium, and you took 70% of that out to another country for enrichment and ensured that when it came back it was only rich for the purposes of making medical isotopes. And you know you need X number of kilograms or pounds to make a nuclear weapon. Well, by taking that 70% out, you have set back the clock from the point in which the Iranians could break out and create a nuclear weapon. So it was a confidence-building measure, which they rejected. It was never an end in itself. Even if they had accepted the compromise measure, you'd still have to negotiate with the Iranians over the total cessation of enrichment on their soil. That was the goal of Israel, it was the goal of the United States, and it was the goal of the other 5 members of the Security Council.
Well, thanks, Michael Oren, for joining us at PJTV. For the full transcript of this interview, visit pajamasmedia.com.